The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, growing larger against the blazing Arizona sky. James Crawford set down his hammer and wiped the sweat from his forehead, watching the distant stagecoach lumber toward his ranch. He had been expecting this moment for 3 months, ever since he had placed that advertisement in the eastern newspapers. What he had not expected was the letter that arrived 2 weeks ago, informing him that not one, but 2 women had responded to his call for a mail-order bride. The ranch stretched across 2,000 acres of harsh desert land, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cluster of cottonwood trees near the creek that ran along the property's eastern border. James had built everything himself over the past 5 years, from the sturdy log cabin to the barn that now housed his small herd of cattle. At 32, he was tired of living alone, tired of talking only to his horse and the occasional traveling merchant who stopped by for water and supplies. The stagecoach rolled to a stop near the front porch, and James straightened his shirt, suddenly aware of how rough he must look after a morning spent mending fence posts. The driver, a grizzled man named Pete, who made this run twice a month, climbed down with a grin that revealed several missing teeth. "Got your packages here, Crawford?" Pete called out, gesturing toward the coach door. "2 of them, just like the letter said." The first woman to step down from the stagecoach was tall and elegant, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat decorated with blue flowers. Her dress was the finest thing James had seen in years, made of dark blue silk that probably cost more than most folks in the territory made in a month. She moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to drawing rooms and afternoon tea, her green eyes taking in the ranch with an expression that was difficult to read. "Mr. Crawford," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I am Miss Elizabeth Hartwell of Boston." Before James could respond, the second woman appeared in the doorway of the stagecoach. Where Elizabeth was tall and refined, this woman was shorter and more practical-looking, with brown hair braided simply down her back and wearing a plain gray dress that had clearly seen considerable travel. Her dark eyes sparkled with curiosity rather than judgment as she looked around the ranch. "And I am Sarah Mitchell, from Ohio," she said, stepping down without assistance and brushing dust from her skirts. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Crawford." Pete unloaded 2 modest trunks and a carpet bag from the back of the coach, accepting the coins James pressed into his hand. "I'll be back through in 2 weeks," he said with a wink. "Reckon you'll have things sorted out by then." As the stagecoach disappeared back down the dusty trail, James found himself standing awkwardly between the 2 women, acutely aware that his simple advertisement had somehow resulted in a situation he was completely unprepared to handle. He had written honestly about his ranch, his desire for companionship, and his ability to provide a good home for the right woman. He had never imagined that 2 women might respond, or that they would both arrive on the same day. "I must apologize," he began, his voice rougher than usual. "There seems to have been some confusion. I only expected—" "1 bride," Elizabeth finished, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Yes, Mr. Crawford, we are both quite aware of the situation. Sarah and I met during our journey west and have had ample time to discuss the circumstances." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "We have decided to let you choose between us, Mr. Crawford. But we would like to stay for a few days if you will have us, so that you might get to know us both before making your decision." James felt heat rising in his cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else he could not say. "Of course you are both welcome here for as long as you need. I have plenty of room, and it would not be right to send either of you back without—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Without giving us all a fair chance to see if we might suit each other," Elizabeth said, removing her gloves with practiced efficiency. "That seems reasonable." The next few hours passed in a blur of practical arrangements. James showed both women to the cabin, pointing out the spare bedroom that he had prepared for his expected bride, as well as a small alcove off the main room where he could string up a curtain for privacy. Sarah immediately volunteered to take the smaller space, insisting that Elizabeth should have the proper bedroom. "I am accustomed to simpler accommodations," Sarah said, setting her carpet bag on the narrow cot. "This will suit me perfectly." Elizabeth surveyed the main room of the cabin with interest, her fingers trailing over the rough-hewn furniture that James had crafted during the long winter evenings. "You made all of this yourself?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Everything except the stove and the dishes. Had those shipped from Phoenix when I first settled here." "It is very well done," she said, and James detected genuine admiration in her voice. "You are clearly a man of many talents, Mr. Crawford." As evening approached, the three of them worked together to prepare a simple dinner. Sarah proved to be an excellent cook, transforming James's usual fare of beans and bacon into something that actually tasted good. Elizabeth, meanwhile, surprised them both by producing a small packet of tea from her trunk, brewing a pot that filled the cabin with a delicate, flowery scent. "My grandmother's blend," she explained when James commented on the aroma. "I brought several packets with me thinking, hoping that my new home might benefit from a few touches of civilization." They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing more easily than James had dared to hope. Sarah told them about her life in Ohio, where she had worked as a schoolteacher until the local school closed due to lack of funding. Elizabeth spoke about Boston, about the social expectations and rigid structure that had led her to seek a new life in the West. "My father wishes me to marry a man of his choosing," she said, cutting her food with precise movements. "A banker who is nearly twice my age and has already buried 2 wives. When I saw your advertisement, Mr. Crawford, it seemed like an answer to a prayer I had not even known I was saying." "And you, Miss Mitchell?" James asked, genuinely curious about what had brought such a capable woman so far from home. Sarah's expression grew more serious. "I lost my position when the new schoolmaster arrived. He made it clear that he believed teaching was work for men only, especially in a frontier community like ours. My family, they have troubles of their own. Too many mouths to feed and not enough land to support them all. I thought perhaps I might find a place where my skills would be valued." James found himself nodding. He understood the practical necessities that drove people to make difficult choices, the way circumstances could narrow your options until even the most uncertain path began to look like freedom. After dinner, they sat on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the scrubland. "It is beautiful here," Elizabeth said softly. "So different from anything I have ever known." "Different can be good," Sarah added. "Sometimes a person needs to get far away from everything familiar to discover who they really are." James listened to them talk, amazed by how comfortable he felt in their company. For 5 years he had lived with only his own thoughts for conversation. Now, suddenly, his small cabin felt alive with the sound of voices, with laughter, with the rustle of skirts, and the gentle clink of teacups. The next morning, James woke to the smell of coffee and eggs cooking over the stove. He dressed quickly and emerged from his small sleeping area to find Sarah already up and preparing breakfast, her hair neatly braided and her sleeves rolled up for work. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford," she said cheerfully. "I hope you do not mind that I took the liberty of starting breakfast. I am an early riser by nature." Elizabeth appeared from the bedroom a few minutes later, looking as elegant as she had the day before, despite the simple surroundings. She had somehow managed to arrange her hair in an intricate style that must have taken considerable time and skill. "Good morning," she said, accepting the cup of coffee that Sarah offered. I must say, Miss Mitchell, you have a remarkable talent for making even the simplest meal smell wonderful. After breakfast, James suggested that he show them around the ranch, thinking that they should see what they would be getting into if either of them decided to stay. They walked first to the barn, where his small herd of cattle clustered around the water trough, and then to the chicken coop, where a dozen hens pecked industriously at the scattered feed. "Do you do all of this work yourself?" Sarah asked, watching him check the animals with practiced efficiency. "Most of it. I hire help during roundup, and when it is time to drive the cattle to market. But day to day, it is just me." He paused, realizing how that might sound. "I mean, it has been just me. I am hoping that will change." Elizabeth surprised him by asking intelligent questions about the ranch operations, about the challenges of raising cattle in the desert, about his plans for expanding the herd. Her questions revealed a sharp mind and a genuine interest in understanding his work. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed drawn to the practical details of ranch life. She asked about the vegetable garden, about preserving food for the winter, about the nearest neighbors and how often the supply wagon came through. Her questions were those of a woman thinking seriously about what it would mean to make a life in this remote place. As they walked back toward the cabin for the midday meal, James found himself torn between admiration for both women. Elizabeth was clearly educated and refined, the kind of woman who would bring grace and culture to his rough frontier home. But Sarah seemed to understand instinctively what ranch life would require, and her practical skills were already making his daily routine easier and more pleasant. That afternoon, while Elizabeth rested in the bedroom, claiming that the desert heat was more intense than anything she had experienced in Boston, Sarah asked if she could help with the afternoon chores. James was hesitant at first, not wanting to put a guest to work. But Sarah insisted that she wanted to understand what would be expected of her if she stayed. Together they repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent windstorm, Sarah holding the posts steady while James nailed the rails into place. She worked without complaint, despite the heat and the rough nature of the task, and James found himself appreciating not just her willingness to help, but her quiet competence. "You handle yourself well for a school teacher," he said, testing the strength of the repair. Sarah laughed, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "My father was a farmer before he hurt his back. I grew up doing work like this. Teaching was something I fell into because I was good with letters and numbers, but I never forgot how to use my hands." That evening, Elizabeth insisted on preparing dinner, wanting to demonstrate her own domestic skills. The meal was elegantly presented and delicious, though James suspected that the ingredients she used represented a significant portion of his monthly supplies. Still, he had to admit that her cooking showed a different kind of skill than Sarah's more practical approach. "In Boston, I managed my father's household for 3 years after my mother died," Elizabeth explained as they ate. "I am quite capable of running a home, though I confess I am more accustomed to having servants to help with the heavier work." "There are no servants here," James said gently. "Just whatever we can manage ourselves." "I understand that, Mr. Crawford. I would not expect the same conveniences here that I enjoyed in the East, but I think you might be surprised by how quickly I could adapt." After dinner, Sarah produced a deck of cards from her bag, and they spent the evening playing simple games and talking about their hopes for the future. Elizabeth spoke about her love of books and her dream of starting a small library wherever she settled. Sarah talked about her desire to teach again, perhaps starting a school for the children of the scattered ranches in the area. "There must be families out here who want their children to learn reading and writing," she said. "I could travel between ranches, or perhaps set up a school in town during the winter months when travel is easier." James found both dreams appealing, though he realized that either woman's presence would change his life in ways he had not fully considered. He had been thinking primarily about companionship and help with the daily work of the ranch. But both Elizabeth and Sarah had ambitions that went beyond simply keeping house and raising children. On the third day, James woke to find both women already up and working together in the kitchen, their voices low and companionable as they prepared breakfast. He lay still for a moment, listening to the sound of their conversation, and realized that this was what he had been missing without knowing it, the warmth of human connection, the sense that his home was truly alive. During breakfast, Elizabeth announced her intention to walk to the creek alone, saying that she wanted some time to think. After she had gone, Sarah asked if she could help James with the morning chores, and they worked together in comfortable silence, each seemingly lost in their own thoughts. "She is a good woman," Sarah said suddenly as they fed the chickens. "Elizabeth, I mean. She would make you a fine wife." James looked at her in surprise. "And what about you?" Sarah's smile was gentle but sad. "I think we both know that you have already made your choice, Mr. Crawford. You have been nothing but kind to both of us. But I have seen how you look at her. She represents something that you want, something that you think will make your life better." "That is not," James began, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Please, let me finish. Elizabeth is everything that a man in your position should want. She is beautiful, educated, well-bred. She will bring refinement to your home and grace to your table. You should not feel guilty for being drawn to those qualities." James found himself at a loss for words, unsure how to respond to Sarah's unexpected directness. He had thought he was being careful not to show favoritism, but apparently his feelings were more transparent than he had realized. "What will you do?" he asked finally. "If you decide not to stay, I mean." "I have been thinking about that," Sarah said, scattering feed to the chickens with practiced movements. "There is a town about 30 miles south of here, according to what Pete told us. They might have need of a teacher, or at least someone who can read and write well enough to help with correspondence and record-keeping." The thought of Sarah leaving filled James with an unexpected sense of loss, though he could not quite put his finger on why. She was right that he was attracted to Elizabeth, drawn by her elegance and the promise of the cultured life she represented. But these 3 days had shown him that Sarah's practical wisdom and gentle humor were equally valuable, equally appealing in their own way. When Elizabeth returned from her walk, she seemed to have reached some decision of her own. Her manner was more reserved than it had been, though still friendly, and James noticed that she spent more time watching him and Sarah work together than participating in the activities herself. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elizabeth finally spoke about what was on her mind. "I have been thinking about what I really want from this new life," she said, her voice thoughtful. "When I left Boston, I was running away from something I did not want rather than running toward something I did want. That is not a good foundation for a marriage or for any important decision." James felt his heart sink, though he tried not to let his disappointment show. "Are you saying that you want to leave?" "I am saying that I think you and Sarah are better suited to each other than you and I would be," Elizabeth said simply. "I have watched you both these past few days, and it is clear that you share something that goes beyond mere attraction or convenience." Sarah looked up in surprise, her cheeks flushing in the lamplight. "Elizabeth, that is not—" "Yes, it is," Elizabeth said firmly but kindly. "And there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is exactly what a marriage should be built on. Mr. Crawford, you admire my education and my manners, but you trust Sarah's judgment. You enjoy my conversation, but you seek Sarah's opinion. Those are the actions of a man who has found his true partner, even if he has not yet admitted it to himself." James looked from Elizabeth to Sarah, seeing the truth of Elizabeth's words reflected in Sarah's face. These 3 days had indeed shown him something he had not expected to find. He had been so focused on the idea of bringing civilization and refinement to his frontier home that he had nearly missed the far more important opportunity to find a true companion for the life he was actually living. "Elizabeth is right," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "I have been a fool thinking I knew what I wanted without understanding what I needed." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, though she was smiling. "Are you certain? I would not want you to choose me simply because Elizabeth thinks you should. I am choosing you because these 3 days have shown me who I am when I am with you," James said, reaching for her hand. "I am choosing you because you see this place the way I do, because you understand what we could build here together. I am choosing you because when I think about the future, you are the one I want to share it with." The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Elizabeth stood up from her chair, brushing dust from her skirts with a satisfied smile. "Well then," she said, "I believe my work here is done. Mr. Crawford, might I trouble you to escort me to town tomorrow? I believe Pete mentioned that the stagecoach stops there twice a week, and I find myself eager to continue my journey west." "Of course," James said, though he looked concerned. "But are you certain? You are welcome to stay as long as you need to make other arrangements." "Thank you, but I am quite certain. This experience has taught me something valuable about myself and what I am looking for. I think I shall continue to California. I have heard that San Francisco is a place where a woman with determination and a good education can make her own way in the world. That appeals to me more than I expected it would." And so it was that the next morning, James hitched up his wagon and drove Elizabeth to the small town of Copper Creek, where she would wait for the westbound stage. She had insisted on paying him for the room and board, despite his protests, and had left a small package for Sarah that she said contained a few things that might be useful for a wedding. The ride to town was pleasant, filled with easy conversation about Elizabeth's plans and James's hopes for the ranch. When they reached the dusty main street of Copper Creek, Elizabeth climbed down from the wagon with the same grace she had shown when stepping out of the stagecoach just 4 days earlier. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford," she said, shaking his hand formally. "I hope you and Sarah will be very happy together." "What about you?" James asked. "Will you be happy?" Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked completely relaxed. "I think I will be. For the first time in my life, I am going somewhere because I want to, not because someone else thinks I should. That feels like the beginning of happiness to me." James watched the stagecoach until it disappeared from sight, carrying Elizabeth toward whatever new adventure awaited her in California. Then he turned his wagon toward home, eager to return to Sarah and to begin the life they would build together. The sun was setting as he reached the ranch, painting the adobe walls of the cabin a warm gold. Sarah was waiting on the porch, wearing a simple blue dress that James had never seen before. Her hair was pinned up in a style that was both practical and pretty, and she wore a small smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Welcome home," she said simply, and James realized that for the first time in 5 years, the word home meant more than just a place where he slept and ate and worked. It meant a place where he belonged, where he was wanted, where he had found not just a wife, but a true partner for all the adventures that lay ahead. 3 days later, James Crawford and Sarah Mitchell were married in the small chapel of Copper Creek by Reverend Thomas, a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the territory. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by the handful of townspeople who had come to know James through his occasional trips for supplies, and witnessed by Doc Harrison, the local physician who had become something of a friend over the years. Sarah wore the blue dress she had put on for James's return from town, along with a small lace veil that had been Elizabeth's parting gift. James had borrowed a proper suit from Doc Harrison, who was roughly the same size, and had spent an hour that morning trying to tame his unruly hair into something resembling respectability. Do you, James Crawford, take Sarah Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Reverend Thomas's voice echoed in the small wooden chapel, which smelled of pine sap and the wild flowers that Sarah had gathered that morning. "I do," James said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. He had never imagined that two simple words could feel so momentous, so full of promise for the future. "And do you, Sarah Mitchell, take James Crawford to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Sarah's voice was clear and strong when she answered, "I do." The ring James slipped onto Sarah's finger had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band that his father had given him before he died, along with instructions to save it for the right woman. As he looked into Sarah's dark eyes, James knew that his father would have approved of his choice. After the ceremony, the small group gathered at the hotel for a wedding dinner that Doc Harrison had insisted on providing. The meal was simple but festive, and James found himself laughing more than he had in years as the townspeople shared stories and offered advice about married life. "The secret," said Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband, "is to never go to bed angry. Hash things out before you lay your head on the pillow, even if it takes all night." "Nonsense," countered old Pete, the stagecoach driver who was between runs. "The secret is to pick your battles. Some hills ain't worth dying on, if you catch my meaning." Doc Harrison raised his glass of whiskey. "The secret is to remember that you are partners in everything from this day forward. The good times and the bad times, the easy decisions and the hard ones. You face it all together." As the evening wore on and the talk turned to ranching and weather and the various challenges facing the territory, James found himself watching his new wife with something approaching wonder. Sarah fit into this gathering as naturally as if she had been born to it, asking thoughtful questions about the local families and offering her own observations about community needs. "We were talking earlier about the children hereabouts," she said to Mrs. Henderson. "How many families would be interested in having their little ones learn reading and writing?" Mrs. Henderson's face lit up. "Oh, my dear, you cannot imagine how much that would mean to folks around here. We have been talking about the need for a school for years, but we could never afford to bring in a proper teacher from back east." "Well," Sarah said with a smile, "you would not need to look that far. I taught for 6 years in Ohio, and I would be delighted to start classes here if there is enough interest." James felt a surge of pride as he listened to his wife make plans to contribute to their community. This was exactly what he had hoped for in a partner, someone who would not just share his life, but help make it richer and more meaningful. The newlyweds returned to the ranch the next afternoon, traveling slowly in the wagon to accommodate the additional supplies they had purchased in town. Sarah had insisted on buying fabric to make curtains for the cabin windows, as well as seeds for expanding the vegetable garden and ingredients for preserving food for the coming winter. "I know it seems like a lot of expense all at once," she said as they bumped along the dusty trail, "but I think we will save money in the long run if we can produce more of our own food." "I trust your judgment," James replied, and meant it. In the week he had known Sarah, she had demonstrated a practical wisdom that complemented his own experience perfectly. Where he tended to focus on the immediate needs of the ranch, she thought ahead to long-term planning and efficiency. Their first months of married life settled into a comfortable rhythm. James continued his work with the cattle and the maintenance of the ranch buildings, while Sarah took charge of the house and garden with an efficiency that amazed him. She seemed to have an instinctive understanding of how to make their limited resources stretch further, turning their simple cabin into a home that was both practical and welcoming. In the mornings, they worked together on the outdoor chores before the heat became too intense. Sarah proved to be as capable with the animals as she had claimed, showing no fear of the cattle and developing a particular rapport with the horses. In the afternoons, while James handled the heavier work or rode out to check on the herd, Sarah worked in the garden or on various domestic projects. Evenings were James's favorite time of day. They would sit on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the desert while they talked about their plans for the ranch, their hopes for the future, or simply shared the comfortable silence of two people who had found their place in the world. "I never realized how much I was missing," James said one evening in late summer, watching Sarah mend one of his shirts by lamplight. "Living alone, I mean. I thought I was content, but I was really just existing." Sarah looked up from her sewing, her eyes soft in the flickering light. "I know what you mean. I was so focused on being independent, on proving that I did not need anyone else, that I forgot how good it could feel to be part of something larger than myself." As autumn approached, Sarah began making inquiries about starting a school for the local children. She wrote letters to the scattered ranch families, introducing herself and describing her qualifications, and was delighted by the positive responses that came back. "The Martinezes have 3 children who have never had formal schooling," she told James one evening, sorting through the latest batch of letters. "And the O'Briens have 2 little girls who are already reading some, but they want them to learn proper writing and arithmetic." "How many families are interested?" James asked. 8 so far, with a total of 18 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. If we could hold classes 3 days a week, I think I could manage groups by age and ability level." James felt a familiar surge of pride in his wife's ambition and capability. "Where would you hold the classes? The cabin is not nearly large enough." Sarah had clearly been thinking about this problem. "I was wondering if we might build a small schoolhouse on the property. Nothing elaborate, just a single room with enough space for desks and a blackboard. The families have all offered to contribute either labor or materials, and I think we could have it ready before winter sets in." The idea appealed to James immediately. A school on their land would bring the community together in a way that would benefit everyone, and it would give Sarah the opportunity to do work that she clearly loved. "Let's do it," he said. "I can start drawing up plans tomorrow." The schoolhouse project became a community effort that exceeded all of their expectations. Word spread beyond the families with school-aged children, and soon neighbors from miles around were offering to help. The men worked together to construct the building, while the women organized meals for the workers and coordinated the donation of supplies. Doc Harrison surprised everyone by contributing a genuine slate blackboard that he had ordered specially from Phoenix. Mrs. Henderson donated chalk, paper, and other school supplies from her store. Even old Pete, the stagecoach driver, got involved by offering to transport any materials that needed to come from town at no charge. "Never seen anything like it," Pete said one afternoon, watching the progress on the schoolhouse frame. "Folks around here have been talking about a school for years, but it took your missus actually stepping up and making it happen to get everyone moving." James nodded, but privately he thought that Sarah's role was more than just taking initiative. She had a talent for bringing out the best in people, for making them feel that their contributions mattered and that they were part of something important. The schoolhouse was completed just as the first cool weather of autumn arrived. It was a simple structure, but well built and perfectly suited to its purpose. The single room had windows on 3 sides to provide good light, a small stove for heat during the winter months, and enough space for 15 students to sit comfortably at the tables that several of the fathers had constructed. On the day of the school's opening, James stood in the doorway watching Sarah organize her first class. She had divided the children into 3 groups based on their existing skills, with the youngest ones learning their letters, while the older students worked on composition and arithmetic. Her manner with the children was patient but firm, encouraging but not permissive. "Mrs. Crawford," said little Maria Martinez, holding up her slate proudly, "I wrote my whole name." "That is wonderful, Maria," Sarah replied, examining the careful letters with appropriate admiration. Tomorrow we will work on writing your family's name as well. James felt his chest swell with pride as he watched his wife in her element. This was what she had been born to do, and seeing her happiness made his own satisfaction with their life together even deeper. As winter approached, the school became the social center of their scattered community. Parents would linger after picking up their children, sharing news and discussing community concerns. Sarah began hosting monthly evening meetings for the adults, covering topics like basic literacy for those who needed it, practical mathematics for ranch management, and letter writing for those who wanted to stay in touch with distant family members. "You have started something bigger than a school," James told her one evening as they cleaned up after a particularly well-attended community meeting. "You have given people a reason to come together, to feel like they are part of something." Sarah smiled as she stacked the slates that the adult students had been using. "A community is like a garden. It needs tending to grow properly, and it flourishes when everyone contributes something to the whole." Their first winter as a married couple was everything James had hoped it would be. The long evenings gave them time to plan for the spring, to read together by the fire, and to simply enjoy each other's company. Sarah proved to be an excellent cook and manager, keeping their food supplies well organized and preparing meals that made even the simplest ingredients taste special. "I never ate this well when I was a bachelor," James said one evening, savoring a stew that Sarah had made from beef, vegetables from their garden, and herbs that she had dried during the summer. "I never cooked for anyone who appreciated it the way you do," Sarah replied. "My family was so large that meals were more about filling bellies than creating something enjoyable." As spring arrived, James began making plans to expand the herd and add more grazing land to the ranch. The school had brought them into contact with several neighbors who were interested in selling small parcels of land, and the additional income from Sarah's teaching was making it possible to consider investments that had previously been beyond their reach. "The Martinez family wants to sell their south pasture," James told Sarah one morning as they discussed their plans over breakfast. "It is good grazing land, and it would connect our property to the creek in a way that would make water management much easier." "How much are they asking?" Sarah asked, her practical mind already working through the financial implications. $500. It is a fair price, and I think we could manage it if we are careful with our other expenses this year." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The teaching money will help, and I have been thinking that we might also consider taking in a few travelers during the busy season. The location is convenient for people heading to Phoenix or Tucson, and we could charge for meals and a place to sleep." The idea had not occurred to James, but it made sense. Their cabin was larger than most in the area, and Sarah's cooking and hospitality skills would make their place an attractive stop for weary travelers. As they discussed the details of these plans, James marveled again at how perfectly their different strengths complemented each other. He brought experience with ranching and land management, while Sarah contributed business sense and social skills that opened up possibilities he never would have considered on his own. By late spring, they had successfully purchased the Martinez land and had begun taking in occasional travelers, just as Sarah had suggested. Word spread quickly among the merchants and settlers who used the various trails through the territory, and soon they had a small but steady stream of guests who were grateful for good food and clean beds. "Mrs. Crawford," said a traveling merchant named Wilson, who had stayed with them twice on his route between Phoenix and El Paso. "I have been telling everyone I meet about this place. You two have created something special here." Sarah smiled as she served him a plate of eggs and bacon for breakfast. "We are just trying to be good neighbors to anyone who passes through." "Well, you are doing more than that. You are providing something that this territory needs. A place where people can rest and feel welcome. That is worth its weight in gold out here." The success of both the school and the guest business filled James with satisfaction, but also with a growing awareness of how much his life had changed since Sarah's arrival. The lonely rancher who had placed that advertisement in the Eastern newspapers felt like a different person entirely. Someone from his past, rather than who he was now. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah suddenly turned to him with a serious expression. "James, there is something I need to tell you," she said, her voice carrying an unusual note of nervousness. James felt his heart skip a beat, worried that she might be having second thoughts about their life together. "What is it?" Sarah smiled, and her nervousness seemed to transform into excitement. "I am going to have a baby." For a moment, James could not speak. He had hoped that they might have children someday, but the reality of it happening felt overwhelming in the most wonderful way possible. "Are you certain?" he asked finally. "Doc Harrison confirmed it yesterday when I went to town for supplies. The baby should arrive sometime in late winter or early spring." James stood up and pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her tight as the magnitude of this news settled over him. They were going to be a family in the fullest sense of the word, and their child would grow up in this community that Sarah had helped create, surrounded by people who cared about education and neighborliness and building something good in the wilderness. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both familiar and newly meaningful. "I love you too," Sarah replied, "and I cannot wait to see what kind of father you will be." As the summer progressed, news of Sarah's pregnancy spread through their community, bringing congratulations and offers of help from their neighbors. The women began organizing to ensure that Sarah would have everything she needed when the baby arrived, while the men started talking about additional improvements to the ranch that might be necessary for a growing family. "You two have become the heart of this community," Mrs. Henderson told Sarah one afternoon when she stopped by to drop off some baby clothes that her own children had outgrown. "People look up to you, depend on you. This baby is going to be like everyone's grandchild." The comment made Sarah think about the responsibility they had taken on, not just for their own family, but for the community that had grown up around their school and their hospitality. It was a good responsibility, the kind that made life meaningful, but it was still a weight that she had not fully considered before. That evening, she shared Mrs. Henderson's comment with James as they worked together in the garden, harvesting vegetables for their evening meal and for the guests who would be arriving later in the week. "Do you think we have bitten off more than we can chew?" she asked. "The school, the guests, the ranch, and now a baby. Sometimes I wonder if we are trying to do too much." James straightened up from the tomato plants he had been examining and looked around at their thriving homestead. The garden was producing more vegetables than they had ever had before. The cattle were healthy and the herd was growing. The schoolhouse was bustling with activity most days of the week. Their cabin was frequently full of travelers who left grateful for the hospitality they had received. "I think," he said slowly, "that we are doing exactly what we are supposed to be doing. Not because someone told us we should, but because it feels right, because it makes use of the gifts we have been given, because it makes life better for the people around us." Sarah nodded, feeling reassured by his perspective. "You are right. I was not worried about whether we could handle it all. I was worried about whether we had the right to become so important to other people's lives." "The right comes from showing up and doing the work," James said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "The right comes from caring enough to try to make things better. You have earned your place here, Sarah. We have earned our place here." As autumn approached and Sarah's pregnancy became more obvious, James found himself thinking often about the future. Their child would grow up in a very different world from the one either parent had known. This baby would be part of a community from birth, would take for granted the school that Sarah had worked so hard to establish, would assume that neighbors helped neighbors and that strangers were welcomed with open arms. It was a good legacy to be building, James thought, as he watched Sarah teach her students one crisp October morning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, and their child would grow up knowing that home was not just a place, but a feeling of belonging that came from being part of something larger and more meaningful than any one person could create alone. The first hard frost came earlier than usual that year, and with it, the unmistakable sense that winter would be longer and more difficult than the mild season they had enjoyed the year before. James began making preparations to ensure that they would have enough feed for the cattle and enough firewood to keep the cabin and schoolhouse warm through the cold months ahead. But as he worked, he felt none of the anxiety that had characterized his previous winters on the ranch. This time, he was not facing the season alone. This time, he had Sarah by his side, a community that would look out for each other, and the promise of new life to welcome when spring finally returned. It was, he thought, as he stacked another cord of firewood outside the cabin, exactly the life he had dreamed of when he first decided to make his home in this harsh and beautiful land. It had just taken him a while to realize that the dream was not about what he could build by himself, but about what he could build with the right partner and the support of good neighbors. The stage was set for whatever challenges winter might bring, and James Crawford felt ready to meet them with the confidence that came from knowing he was no longer alone. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped far below anything James had experienced in his 5 previous years on the ranch. By January, the snow was piled so high around the cabin that he had to dig tunnels to reach the barn and chicken coop. And even with the extra firewood he had cut, they were burning through their supply faster than he had anticipated. Sarah, now 6 months pregnant and moving more slowly than usual, insisted on maintaining the school schedule despite the harsh conditions. The children from the closest families still made the journey 3 days a week, arriving bundled in every piece of warm clothing their families could spare, and leaving with hot meals that Sarah prepared to help them face the cold trip home. "You should rest more," James told her one particularly bitter morning as he watched her prepare lessons despite the early hour. "The children would understand if you closed the school until spring." "The children need consistency even more during difficult times," Sarah replied, stirring a pot of oatmeal over the stove. "Besides, their families depend on those 3 days to get other work done. We cannot let them down just because the weather is challenging." James knew better than to argue with his wife when she had made up her mind about something, but he worried about the strain she was putting on herself. The baby was due in just over 2 months, and the combination of teaching, managing their guests, and maintaining the household was clearly wearing on her, despite her attempts to hide it. His worries proved justified when, in the middle of February, a particularly severe storm struck just as the school day was ending. The wind howled around the cabin with a fury that shook the walls, and the snow fell so thick that James could barely see the schoolhouse from the main building. "The children cannot travel in this," Sarah said, peering out the window at the white wall of snow that surrounded them. "We will have to keep them here until it passes." James nodded, already calculating how many people they would need to feed and house until the storm ended. There were 8 children at school that day, ranging in age from 6 to 13, along with Sarah's assistant, Mrs. Martinez, who had been helping with the younger students since Sarah's pregnancy had advanced. They spent the afternoon moving mattresses and blankets into the schoolhouse, which had a larger open area than the cabin and could accommodate everyone more comfortably. Sarah organized games and stories to keep the children calm and entertained, while James and Mrs. Martinez worked to ensure that there was enough food and fuel to last until the storm passed. By evening, it was clear that the blizzard was not going to be a brief affair. The wind continued to howl, and the snow kept falling with an intensity that blocked all visibility beyond a few feet. James strung ropes between the buildings to ensure that no one would get lost trying to move between them, and they settled in for what he suspected would be several days of waiting. The first night passed peacefully enough. The children treated the unexpected sleepover as an adventure, and Sarah kept them busy with lessons that were more like entertainment than formal education. But by the second day, as the storm showed no signs of abating, James began to worry about their supplies and about Sarah's condition. "How are you feeling?" he asked her privately when she took a break from teaching the children to do simple arithmetic problems. "Tired," she admitted, sitting down heavily on one of the benches. "And my back has been aching more than usual. But I am fine, James. Do not worry." But James did worry, especially when he noticed that Sarah was holding her lower back more frequently and that her face was occasionally tight with discomfort that she was clearly trying to hide. On the third day of the storm, as James was checking on the animals in the barn, he heard Mrs. Martinez calling for him from the schoolhouse. The urgency in her voice sent him running through the knee-deep snow, his heart pounding with fear about what he might find. He burst through the schoolhouse door to find Sarah sitting on one of the benches, her face pale and her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. "The baby," she said quietly, her voice strained. "I think the baby is coming." James felt the world tilt around him. The baby was not due for another 6 weeks, and they were trapped by the storm with 8 children, no doctor, and no way to get help from town. "Are you certain?" he asked, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. Sarah nodded, closing her eyes as another contraction gripped her. "The pain started this morning, but I thought they were just from being tired. But they are getting stronger and closer together." Mrs. Martinez stepped forward, her expression calm despite the gravity of the situation. "I have delivered 3 babies for my neighbors over the years," she said quietly to James. "I am not a doctor, but I know what to do." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. Mrs. Martinez was a practical woman with 6 children of her own, and if she said she could help, he believed her. "What do you need?" he asked. "Hot water, clean towels, and somewhere private for Sarah to lie down. And someone needs to keep the children calm and occupied while we work." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. James boiled water and gathered supplies while Mrs. Martinez helped Sarah to a makeshift bed they created in the corner of the schoolhouse behind a curtain. The oldest of the students, 13-year-old Tom O'Brien, took charge of the younger children, organizing them into quiet games and storytelling sessions that kept them distracted from what was happening just a few feet away. "Is Mrs. Crawford going to be all right?" asked little Maria Martinez, Mrs. Martinez's youngest daughter. "She is going to be fine," Tom said with the confidence of someone who was trying very hard to believe his own words. "My mama says that having babies is hard work, but that it always turns out happy in the end." James wished he could share Tom's confidence. But as the hours passed and Sarah's labor intensified, he found himself praying harder than he had ever prayed in his life. The storm continued to rage outside, making it impossible to even think about getting help from town, and the early arrival of the baby filled him with worry about both Sarah's health and the child's chances of survival. "She is doing well," Mrs. Martinez assured him during one of the brief moments when Sarah was resting between contractions. "The baby is eager to meet the world, but everything is progressing as it should." As evening approached, the storm finally began to show signs of weakening. The wind was not howling quite as fiercely, and the snow was falling less heavily. But James barely noticed. His attention focused entirely on Sarah and the battle she was fighting to bring their child safely into the world. Just as the sun was setting behind the clearing clouds, filling the schoolhouse with golden light that filtered through the snow-covered windows, Sarah gave one final, tremendous push, and the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. "It is a girl," Mrs. Martinez announced, her voice filled with joy and relief. "A beautiful, healthy girl." James felt tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Martinez placed the tiny, perfect baby in Sarah's arms. She was smaller than he had expected, but her cries were strong and her movements vigorous. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse from exhaustion but glowing with happiness. "Welcome to the world." The children had been trying to be quiet during the final stages of labor, but when they heard the baby cry, they erupted in cheers and applause that filled the schoolhouse with celebration. "Can we see her?" Maria asked, creeping closer to the curtain that separated Sarah's corner from the rest of the room. "In a little while," Mrs. Martinez said gently. "Let Mama and Papa have a few minutes to get acquainted with their daughter first." James sat on the edge of the bed, marveling at the tiny person who had just entered their lives. The baby had Sarah's dark hair and what appeared to be his blue eyes, and she had stopped crying as soon as she was placed in her mother's arms, as if she already knew where she belonged. "What should we call her?" he asked, reaching out to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. "I was thinking about Hope," Sarah said, looking down at their daughter with wonder, "because she chose to come into the world in the middle of a storm, surrounded by children and neighbors who love her already. She is hope for the future, hope that good things can happen even when circumstances are difficult." "Hope Crawford," James repeated, testing the name. "I like it. It suits her." By the time the storm finally ended the next morning, word had somehow spread to the surrounding ranches that there had been a birth at the Crawford place. Despite the challenging traveling conditions, neighbors began arriving throughout the day, bringing food, baby clothes, and congratulations for the new family. Doc Harrison was among the first to arrive, having made the difficult journey from town as soon as the roads were passable. He examined both Sarah and baby Hope, pronouncing them both healthy and strong despite the early arrival and challenging circumstances of the birth. "I have seen many babies born in difficult situations," he told James as they stood on the porch, watching the neighbors come and go. "But I have never seen one welcomed by an entire community the way this little girl has been. She is going to grow up knowing that she is loved and valued by everyone around her." Over the next few days, as Sarah recovered and they all adjusted to life with a new baby, James marveled at how the crisis had brought their community even closer together. The children who had been trapped at the school during the storm had become Hope's honorary older siblings, taking turns holding her and helping with small tasks. Mrs. Martinez had essentially moved in to help with the baby and the household, refusing to accept payment for her assistance. "It is what neighbors do for each other," she said when James tried to thank her for the 100th time. "Besides, I love babies, and my own children are all too old now to need the kind of attention that Hope requires." As spring arrived and life on the ranch returned to a more normal rhythm, James often found himself reflecting on how much his world had changed since that dusty afternoon when the stagecoach had arrived with 2 mail-order brides. The lonely man who had placed that advertisement felt like someone from another lifetime, someone who had not yet understood that the best things in life were not achieved alone, but built together with people who shared your values and your dreams. Sarah returned to teaching when Hope was 6 weeks old, bringing the baby to school with her and delighting the children, who took turns helping to care for their teacher's daughter. The schoolhouse had to be expanded that summer to accommodate the growing number of families who wanted their children educated, and Sarah hired 2 additional teachers to help manage the increased enrollment. The guest business also continued to thrive, with travelers often commenting that the Crawford Ranch had become famous throughout the territory for its hospitality and its role as a community center. James had to build additional guest quarters to handle the demand, and Sarah organized the neighborhood women into a cooperative that provided meals, laundry services, and other amenities that made their establishment a preferred stop for anyone traveling through the area. "You have created something remarkable here," said a government surveyor who stayed with them one evening in late summer. "Most frontier communities struggle to establish even the most basic services. You have managed to build a genuine town center without even trying." "We were not trying to build anything in particular," Sarah said, bouncing Hope on her lap as they sat on the porch after dinner. "We were just trying to meet the needs we saw around us." "That is exactly my point," the surveyor replied. "You saw what was needed, and you provided it, without waiting for someone else to take the initiative. That is what builds civilization in places like this." As autumn approached, and Hope celebrated her first 6 months of life, James and Sarah began making plans for the future. The success of their various enterprises had provided them with financial security that exceeded anything James had imagined when he was a solitary rancher, and they were considering additional investments that could benefit the entire community. "The territorial government has been asking about establishing an official post office out here," Sarah told James one evening as they discussed a letter they had received from the capital. "They want to know if we would be interested in serving as the postmaster and postmistress." James considered the idea. An official post office would make communication much easier for all the scattered ranch families, and it would provide another source of income for their growing family. More importantly, it would give their community an official status that might lead to additional government services and recognition. "It would mean more responsibility," he said. "It would also mean more opportunities to serve our neighbors," Sarah replied. "And it would guarantee that Hope grows up in a place that the outside world recognizes as a real community, not just a collection of isolated homesteads." They decided to accept the appointment, and by Christmas of that year, the Crawford Ranch had become the official postal center for the surrounding area. The small building they constructed to house the post office also served as a general store, a place where neighbors could gather to share news, and a meeting hall for community events. On Christmas Eve, as they hosted the first annual community Christmas celebration, James stood in the doorway of the packed schoolhouse, watching his neighbors celebrate together. Children performed songs that Sarah had taught them, families shared food and gifts, and Hope gurgled happily in the arms of whoever was holding her at the moment. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, appearing at his elbow with a cup of hot cider. "I am more than happy," James replied, putting his arm around his wife as they watched their community celebrate. "I am grateful. For you, for Hope, for all of this. When I placed that advertisement in the newspaper, I was hoping to find someone to share my life with. I never imagined that I would find someone who would help me build a life worth sharing." Sarah smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "The best things happen when you are open to possibilities you never considered. I came here thinking I was just looking for a husband and a new place to live. Instead, I found a home, and a purpose and a future that is bigger and better than anything I ever dreamed." As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, James thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought them all together. If Elizabeth had not been on that stagecoach, if she had not been wise enough to recognize that he and Sarah were better suited for each other, if the storm had not trapped them all together during Hope's birth, if any of a dozen small decisions had been made differently, their lives might have turned out very differently. But somehow, despite all the uncertainties and challenges, everything had worked out exactly as it should. The mail-order bride advertisement that had seemed like such a desperate measure had led to a love story that was bigger than just two people finding each other. It had become the foundation for a community that would endure for generations, a place where children would grow up knowing that they were valued and supported, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where strangers were always welcomed with open arms. Years later, when Hope was old enough to ask about how her parents had met, James and Sarah would tell her the story of the two male brides and the choice that had been made in the space of a few days. They would tell her about Elizabeth's wisdom and generosity, about the blizzard that had brought the community together during her birth, about the gradual building of something meaningful and lasting in a place that had once seemed impossibly remote and challenging. But that night, as they tucked their infant daughter into her cradle and prepared for sleep, they simply held each other and marveled at the unexpected richness of the life they had built together. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees, carrying the promise of spring and the certainty that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, surrounded by the community they had helped create and the love they had discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. James Crawford had sought a mail-order bride to ease the loneliness of frontier life. Instead, he had found a partner who had helped him understand that the best kind of life was not one that avoided difficulty and uncertainty, but one that embraced the challenges of building something meaningful with people who shared your values and your determination to make the world a little bit better for those who came after you. As he drifted off to sleep that Christmas Eve, with Sarah breathing softly beside him and Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, James smiled, thinking about the dusty afternoon when the stagecoach had arrived with two women and a choice that had changed everything. It had been, he realized, the luckiest day of his life, even though he had not understood it at the time. The lone rancher's barn had indeed held two male brides, and before night fell, one had become his wife. But more than that, they had become the foundation of a community, the beginning of a legacy, and the living proof that the best things in life happen when you are brave enough to open your heart to possibilities you never imagined. Hope Crawford would grow up in a world where such possibilities were taken for granted, where community was a given rather than something to be built from scratch, where the idea that neighbors help neighbors and strangers are welcomed was simply the way things were supposed to be. It was a good inheritance, James thought, and one that had begun with a simple advertisement in a distant newspaper and the willingness of three people to take a chance on an uncertain future. The story of the two male brides had become the story of a community, and that community would continue to grow and thrive long after the particular challenges and uncertainties of frontier life had given way to the different challenges and opportunities of a more settled world. But the values that had built it, cooperation, generosity, hard work, and the belief that people could create something better together than any of them could achieve alone, those values would endure, passed down from parents to children and from neighbors to newcomers, ensuring that the legacy of that dusty afternoon would continue for generations to come.